like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, the dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time.
All right, Connor Tomlinson, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Good to be back, sir, and I'm glad to be back after you've done the face reveal and you've decided to just completely aesthetically mock me.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. There was another guy who just came out, Johan Kurz, not too long ago. And, the joke about, they always say like, oh, you right-wing anons, you're all freaks in your mother's basement. It's not true, right? We tend to be normal guys. So yeah, I appreciate the compliment. And I'm glad to actually speak to you face to face. It's much easier than through a profile picture.
Yeah. It reminds me of the Lomas docs, and it was like, oh, Jonathan Keeperman, who like coaches his daughter's basketball team and is an accomplished academic and an absolute Chad. Oh no, the horror! How will the right ever recover? But yeah, good.
Yeah, exactly. Like we showed you. You thought he was some anonymous freak, and he's actually a relatively well-respected, collegiate level athlete and academic. It's like,
now leave me alone while I true now.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it was kind of funny. I don't know if you remember, this is a minor news story, but the 22-year-old 14-stone Hispanic woman that the Democrats selected to win back the Gen Z vote, this is something she was talking about. She's like, oh, this is what real political activism looks like. And it's this sort of goblina, sitting on a couch eating packaged chips. And you're like, you know what? I think it was Voltaire, right, who said, I ask God to make my enemies ridiculous. And, it's not the worst situation to be in.
Yeah, I'm afraid I didn't actually read that particular post because I don't speak Huttese. So
I have a horrible curse I feel the compulsion to follow all of the worst people on the internet on Twitter. And it's got to the point where it's very confusing, where I can't remember why I followed this person. I'm like, did I agree with this at one point? Am I following this just to keep up with what they're saying? Or is this someone joking? And I can't tell. So it's made the app even more difficult to use, really due to my own, I guess, just failure to understand it. But it is, I guess, and this is not what we're here to talk about, it is sort of interesting to see the institutions where you have that sort of backing, right? Where you have all of the money and you're sort of exempt from the actual sort of meritocracy that affects especially dissident right-wing media. Like, you can be the selected face of the DNC and be absolutely useless. Whereas on our side of things, you actually have to work hard and be fairly competent. And purely on physiognomy alone, it sorts out. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's not the case in the British right, as I've tried to explain recently. We are still going through the teething pains of, I think what's been resurging recently in the Republican Party and with the podcast space, but of just chronic gatekeeping and the untrustworthiness that the establishment right and its various parties and press outlets, who all seem to be owned by the same people, mainly Paul Marshall, the untrustworthiness with which they regard young right-wing talent, sort of censoring them, blacklisting them, deplatforming them, has led them to become beech trees under which nothing grows. And when they do try to bring people in-house and cultivate their own talent to astroturf them, they are usually unattractive, incapable of growing an organic following, and just look ridiculous. So ironically, it's not just the dissident right over in the States who are now becoming ascendant within the administration. Our guys are in various departments. There's a poster to Oval Office pipeline with the likes of Doyle and Oral McIntyre. But over in the UK, we are so dissident that there's barely a right. The ostensible right are completely wretched. They were just in power for 14 years, and they were all doing drink and drugs and gay hookups, which meant that they were utter moral reprobates and cowards. But the ostracized young talent is not just more attractive, better read, more outspoken, But also, I can just say there are a lot of guys like us where they don't fall afoul of those social pitfalls that you get in Washington, D.C., New York, or London. They are largely sober. They're monogamous, heterosexual, either engaged or married, and almost unblackmailable. And so that makes them a force to be reckoned with when eventually those drawbridges lower and they do enter those institutions.
Well, certainly. And I don't want to paint too rosy a picture of the U.S. Recently, and I sort of don't want to actually talk about anything relating to the Tucker Fuentes controversy for fairly obvious reasons. But it's clear that that has been used as a wedge, as an attempt to bring the right sort of back onto the plantation, back into the master's house, as I said in an essay I wrote recently. And it's interesting to me, and this is a point that Tucker himself made, sort of jousting with Shapiro, where he said, look, like, you're not real. You were driven to this point through, one, an immense amount of backing early. You were given a lot of money from sources that are, probably best left unnamed. And then even on Facebook, you were given, during the era of Facebook, when that was where the discourse was happening, you were given a shield. Your competition on the same side was banned, was blocked, was driven off the platform, but not you. And so you arrived at this place, again, due to really no particular amount of talent. And then the moment that you faced an actual real opposition, and look, like, this is completely unrelated to wherever anyone falls on that spectrum between, Shapiro and Tucker, Shapiro and others, completely putting that to the side. The way that he is acted, just absolutely frantically throwing out, ad hominem insults, losing his mind. It's like, oh, you're not really used to this, are you? You're not really used to having to defend your position. You're used to having a bully pulpit. And I think there's another dynamic at play here, which is the default party in America, sort of the selected winners are the Democrats. And labor doesn't quite have the same relationship to power. I think, looking from the outside looking in, it's a different relationship. And so even our establishment right is not quite as, like, for instance, the Republican Party has never been the party of the civil service. The Republican Party has never been the entrenched party in Washington. And so even the neocons, right, who perhaps came the closest to that, have never really had the same cachet that the Conservative Party had. Again, I am an outsider in your country's politics. I think that's part of the asymmetry. But to your point, like, the UK Conservative Party is incredibly, like, I just find it morally affronting how they act. Like, and look, like, the Republicans love to lose as well. But to your point, being in power for 14 years, right, a decade and a half, and having conserved less than nothing, pushing out, all of the kind of most left-wing desires, of their ostensible opposition. It's incredibly irritating. But look, like, we can bash the sort of nominal center right all day. But I actually wanted to talk to you about a specific incident because, one, this is completely, like, I do not understand how such a thing can happen on multiple levels. But also, I think it sort of exemplifies a wider problem, which is the sort of comedic accidental release of one Hadush Kabantu. I literally cannot read his middle name. I realize I'm an American and so cannot pronounce the words of other cultures, but this is, to say Star Wars name is perhaps an understatement. It's just like an absolute, like, jumbled mess of syllables. But if you could, Connor, could you describe who this man is, why he's significant, and then the somewhat bizarre circumstances of his release from prison?
Yeah, he's almost an avatar of state betrayal, bureaucratic incompetence, and the unwillingness to evict the thousands of foreign criminals that keep breaking into our country every day. The millions that have come in the last few years by illegal and legal means. So Hadush Kabatu, as you said, Star Wars name that we should never be pronouncing. Like, I should not be speaking the black tongue of Mordor in the Shires, and the fact that it is necessary to understand the goings on in the Shire should tell you just how bad things have gotten. But Hadush Kabatu broke into the country in summer of 2024, and 8 days after arriving from Ethiopia, he crossed all across Europe and arrived in Britain, the first safe country he could reach, because I mean, I wouldn't want to live in France either. But anyway, so he arrived, and then 8 days later, he sexually propositioned a 14-year-old schoolgirl in uniform, and also attempted to proposition a couple of other women. But it was the 14-year-old schoolgirl that caught everyone's attention because, 14-year-old schoolgirl. And then what ended up happening was, when the parents got wind of this, they demanded answers and found out this man was being hosted in the Bell Hotel in Epping, which was what we do in Britain is similar to what you guys were doing in New York under the Biden administration, where we take thousands of illegal immigrants and put them up in taxpayer-funded hotels at the public expense. The last bill that was totaled was, I think, £145 a day per migrant. So it's like 5.4 billion a year, with these contracts going on indefinitely. In 2024, the total cost for illegal migration taken out of the foreign aid budget spent in our country was at least 14.4 billion, and that includes translation services, legal aid, DJ lessons, PlayStations, and a minibus to take them to the seaside, which one of them burned down. So Hadush Kabatu was being housed in this hotel right near a school, and there are multiple issues with that. Number one, in August of 2023, I helped GB News break a story where people smugglers were filming women and girls in secret when they were on nights out, drunk, walking around in states of undress by Islamic standards, short skirts that would be considered immodest, and that people smuggling gangs were marketing these videos alongside footage of men breaking under the border fences of Eastern Europe or crossing the channel in dinghies, as well as footage of Africans with white girlfriends and throwing money around and burning churches, as if to imply, if you pay for our services from North Africa, you will end up in the UK with a white wife, the women are up and waiting for it, you'll get lots of money, you'll be a Deliveroo driver and live like a king by nightfall, and Europe will allow you to do this. And so the men were being broadcast their predatory intent for white women and girls before they arrived. And the government knew this was going on, did nothing. And they only acted in 2025 in April when they invited Meta and TikTok and the like to come to a summit in London and ask them to please take down these videos. But, we've recently had one where they were showing ISIS footage alongside border crossings as well, so we know what kind of men these are. And we've had multiple instances now of illegal immigrants milling about outside of school gates, and the police have denied to journalists that this was going on, but the teachers and police have both sent letters to concerned parents saying this is going on, it's a cultural issue. And when a parent rang the front desk of the hotel, the woman on the desk said, yeah, we've had a lot of reports about this happening. So anyway, look, all these guys are being brought into our country. They're being battery farmed at taxpayers' expense right near schools, in Altrincham, in Epping, etc. This spawned an entire summer of protests. This spawned the Pink Ladies movement, where a bunch of mums wore pink t-shirts, did a conga line outside a hotel in Canary Wharf, where it turns out migrants were moved from the Bell Hotel in Epping, moved to Canary Wharf, the Britannia Hotel, a 4-star resort. And then one of those African migrants actually broke into a blind woman's home to sexually predate on her. And then the daughter that went down to the hotel to demand answers and carried a knife to arm herself was arrested before this African migrant in question. So all of this happened during the summer. And then it comes out that Hadush Kabatu, the sex offender in question, was taken to trial and denied the offence. Now, the judge acquiesced to the argument by the defense barrister that said, because he hasn't committed a crime across Europe as far as we know, and because he has no other offences between breaking into our country and the 8 days later when he tried to proposition a schoolgirl, he's a man of good character. And so the judge agreed he's of good character. So even despite lying about it, doing it, being convicted for it, they said he's of good character. So then Kabatu is taken to prison and put on the shortlist for deportation. But what ends up happening, even despite him saying, I want to be deported, Britain is a madhouse, please get me out of here, even despite this, the police let him go. They just let him walk free on the streets because the bureaucracy didn't tell them who to hand him off to in order to be deported. So Kabatu, comedically, well, it shouldn't be funny because he's a sex offender, walks back to the prison and goes, Am I not meant to be in prison? Is someone not meant to pick me up? And because the computer didn't tell them what to do, they just sent him away. So he found a group of Africans in the town centre, asked them for directions, presumably money to board a train, and just began walking about in his prison tracksuit with an avocado tote bag in London, just going to the library, running errands, blissfully unaware there's a nationwide manhunt for him in the most surveilled city in the world, trying to find this one Ethiopian sex offender that the police have let go. This isn't the only instance, by the way. there was, what was he, Algerian sex offender that was released recently, was caught on camera by a member of the public, arrested. There happened to be a Sky News reporter on scene to capture his arrest, and he said it wasn't him. Then when they showed him a photo, he then admitted it was him. And when the Sky News van guy said, why didn't you hand yourself in if you're saying they weren't meant to release you? He said, you're the police, do your job. So he blamed the police for not... Anyway, so Kabatu was then spotted in Finsbury Park, near the famous mosque, near where this Algerian sex offender happened to be, by the way. And there's been lots of rumors that I've reported on before about jihadist training camps and various Islamic countries emptying themselves of terrorists and criminals who have been stockpiling weapons in mosques and basically plotting terror attacks. So that's something to watch out for. But Kabatu was spotted a couple of days later by a dog walker who alerted the police to his presence. They sent 2 female officers to arrest him. And then David Lammy, who is the Justice Secretary now, who is genuinely the dumbest man in Britain. Like, he thought that Henry VII came before Henry VI on Mastermind. Just absolute embarrassment. Him, Mike Tapp, some of these like Labour MP apologists that have just won their seats because the Conservative Party was so bad that Labour got a landslide despite being the most unpopular government on record. They were celebrating it as a win that he was deported the next day. Hadush Kabatu has been sent back to Ethiopia. A couple of hours later, turns out we paid him £500 for the privilege of fucking off. So we paid him a year's salary in Ethiopia for breaking into our country, 8 days later trying to sexually assault a 14-year-old schoolgirl and tell her he wants to make Jamaican babies, lying about doing so, then causing a nationwide panic when he was accidentally released by incompetent police. He gets rewarded with a massive salary to do it. So the message we're sending to every sex offender in the Horn of Africa is, come to Britain, we're open. Apparently our women and girls are just ripe for exploitation because the government will pay you to predate on them.
It's genuinely absurd, particularly when we contrast this with, as you've said, this is the most surveilled city in the world. I've been reliably informed that if you say certain words or intonate even kind of vaguely your attitudes towards new arrivals, there are 24-hour courts, round the clock judges to throw you in jail. I can't remember her name, but recently a counselor's wife was charged. Serious time.
Yeah, Lucy Connolly got 34 months in prison. Well, it was 31 months. Can we contrast that with an Eritrean sex offender who sexually assaulted a 19-year-old girl with learning difficulties near Heathrow Airport, where he was being housed in a hotel? He got 14 months for that offence, and then was given no further prison time because his time on remand awaiting trial, when he had denied doing it, was counted in his prison sentence. So, legal migrant, sex offender, gets half the sentence of a mum who sends a tweet that she then deletes.
It's genuinely absurd. And I don't say that to make fun of your country. Obviously, we have our own problems here, very dire ones. But to say that the amount of just hatred the ruling class in your country seems to display to their own citizens, the people who live there, it is blood boiling. And I think it's also important to discuss the relative increase in criminality and in your country. Because look, like, we understand a lot of the kind of, like, we can use the term sloppyism about, the kind of like sensationalized headlines about, you can't go out in London without your chainmail on. You got to understand that in absolute terms, your entire country is much safer than mine. Obviously, there's, different demographics, different areas of the country. But in relative terms, from the safety in pretty much any city in your nation 10, 20, 30, certainly years ago, it has become much, much worse, much more dangerous. And one of the things I was thinking about, I was listening to a conversation between Morgoth's Review and Mark from Not So Obvious, and they were talking about this, the transition over time from a country where certainly bad things happen, there was crime, there were serial killers, to this kind of third world violence, where you have cases like Axel Rubicabana, I think that's how you say his name, where he goes in with a knife, goes on a mass stabbing spree. You have, according to their data, I will run with it, effectively one of these a year. 29 cases in the last 30 years. And of those, nearly 2/3 have no official motive, didn't say why he did it, wasn't out to get revenge, just decided to go on a stabbing spree. And 100% of them, shall we say, are Can't find their last name in the muster rolls for the English Civil War. They're new arrivals. And so again, this is materially a very dramatic change. And to me, I guess it's particularly dramatic because, look, America's always been a rough and tumble, dangerous place. Like, it simply is. We're sort of okay with it to some degree or another. And that doesn't mean that, third world immigration doesn't cause problems here. It certainly does. But in a place like, England, which was renowned for its efficiency of justice, its safety, to be reduced to a situation where you can be given half of the time of someone saying something mean for a sexual assault, where you can simply be paid money after you have propositioned an underage girl. It's genuinely absurd. So I've got a question. What do you make of the increase in, shall we say, public dissatisfaction? Obviously, over the summer, there were, as in Epping and other places, a series of, shall we say, spirited protests. I'll leave it at that. But also, there was I believe it was the Raise the Colors movement, painting, St. George's Cross around. So what is the sort of the energy on the ground? How does the normal Brit seem to be reacting to this?
So I'll pick up on a few things there. The first thing to note is every single crime committed by someone who is not an indigenous Brit, so English, Scottish, Welsh, Irish, ethnically, is a choice. They were here as a consequence of government policy. They can be removed as a consequence of government policy, and so we do not have to live like this. And so we can instantly reduce our crime rate to be far lower overnight if we had the sufficient political will. A few stats for you. More than half of all sex crimes in London are committed by a man of foreign nationality. Not ethnicity, nationality. Ethnicity isn't even provided. So that means an overwhelming majority of sex crimes committed in London, where a rape is reported every hour, are committed by non-natives. Because, of course, just having a British passport, having the paperwork, having walked through the gates of Heathrow and Gatwick, does not make one British. Despite what Shabana Mahmood, Pakistani Muslim woman who says she is English, insists. And she said that about Anthony Williams, we must say alleged, but he was caught on CCTV, brandishing a knife in a barber shop, slashing a 14-year-old across the face, and then trying to stab 11 people on a train to Huntingdon a couple of weeks ago. She said that about him because he is an African, but he has a British passport and he's born in Britain. Now, when you mention these mass stabbings, they're almost always committed by Africans. And the reason seems to be the lack of motive is not just, the likes of Axel Rudikabana, who told classmates he wanted white genocide, who kept buying machetes and bows and arrows and making rice in with the money and the Amazon account that his parents gave him, researching genocides with the broadband and the tablet that they paid for. The parents knew all of this and sought to actually cover it up from the authorities. They knew their son was a violent psycho, and they made excuses for him every time and actually funded his lifestyle. It's not just these sort of like anti-white ideological motives. It is consistently them just being out of their minds, being solipsistic by the fact that they have low IQs and no impulse control, and potential lifestyle factors that exacerbate that, a high rate of cannabis and drug use in African and Caribbean communities, to where rates of diagnosed psychosis among black men in Britain are 9 to 10 times higher than white men. And that's not even English men, for whom it is lower. That's just white, generally. So there is a massive, disproportionate rate of violent schizophrenia among black men, whether that's genetic, whether that's cultural. Nobody knows. Nobody wants to touch that third rail. All we know is we live among dangerous people who don't need to be here. The same goes for overall sex offences in the country. So the majority of men breaking in via the small boats are from Afghanistan and Eritrea. The British government also took out a super injunction to keep from public knowledge for multiple years the fact that they were flying in Afghans directly from Kabul, many of whom were Taliban fighters, drug dealers, and sex offenders, and who could import up to 22 of their clan members because a judge ruled that family means something different over there. The British government took out an injunction to stop the public from knowing about it. Those men from Afghanistan and Eritrea are 20 to 22 times more likely per capita than the British national to commit a sex offence. The largest ethnicity for sex offences, nationality, not ethnicity, sorry, same thing, for committing sex offences in the UK is from India. So in total terms, it's not per capita, but remember, the fact that these people aren't native means that none of them need to be here whatsoever. Their very presence is a choice. So the fact that the public know this is the case, they know they don't have to live like this, they know these men don't need to be in their country, they know that all of these atrocities never needed to happen, they know that random women in the last week didn't need to be stabbed to death in Birmingham within a couple of days of each other, one by a repeat offender who was meant to serve a 16-year jail sentence for manslaughter and like the 11-year jail sentence for 3 accounts of rape and kept getting out early and has now killed someone allegedly. They know they don't need to do this. The atrocities are in the headlines every day. And so they turn to political parties to redress their grievances. Now, you said earlier that Labour and Conservatives don't have the same dynamic as the Republicans and Democrats. They did for a very long time. That cartel has been broken up by the presence of Reform UK, who are now being forced, dragged, kicking and screaming by people they've denounced as the online right, including yours truly, to become more right-wing, to commit to deporting every foreign criminal and illegal immigrant in the country. They've said they want mass deportations, despite denouncing it a year earlier, a move which privately pissed off the Trump administration, I can tell you that. And they have been demanded to take action on legal migration, but they still aren't up to speed of where the public are, because the public, it's like 47% in a recent YouGov poll, said that not just illegal migrants, but large numbers of legal migrants, given permanent settlement rights, should be made to leave. So the public, the British public, are on board for remigration, like full-blown, denaturalized, deport, strip of citizenship. I don't care if you were born here, you are foreign, you're a criminal, you're costing me money, you have to be sent back. And no party, no elected, established political party, or no party that has a hope of winning the next election, is representing that position. But when sensible commentators and people like myself or Douglas Carswell, the former UKIP MP and Conservative MP, when popular people write about this issue and they express it in clear terms, they get public support. Much more so than the dying audiences of the BBC, ITV, Sky News, etc., who have to lie about their political opponents, like President Trump, in order to contort this false narrative and insist to people that these crimes aren't really happening. There's this guy who's basically Britain's reverse Jim Cramer, guy called Fraser Nelson. Don't go in his X comments because you will be blocked by presenting the facts. But his job is to literally gaslight the public while positioning himself as an ostensible right-winger. He was the former editor of The Spectator. And anytime a migrant crime epidemic happens, he comes out with a graph that says, well, look at this graph. Don't you see that life is getting better? Pay no attention to the fall of Rome happening behind you. The graph in question measures people's subjective perceptions of crimes according to a survey and obscures the data by counting all crimes. It doesn't disaggregate by the ethnicity and the nationality of the perpetrator, and it doesn't disaggregate the types of crimes that are going up: rapes, knife murders, which are disproportionately committed by non-Indigenous people, from things like property theft, which is going down, but it's only because the majority of police forces haven't solved a single burglary in the last year, and so people are reporting it less. And so all of these crimes are preventable. Certain violent crimes are going up. Those crimes aren't committed by the natives. No party or politician will be honest about this. And until they are honest about it and accept the implications, being we can shut our doors to the third world and remigrate people who are going to be disproportionately likely to commit this and have committed it, then the problem doesn't get fixed.
Yeah, well, and I think that's sort of an interesting thing, because the way that mass migration is sold, and we're actually in the process of sort of an inter-right-wing squabble about this, right? The H-1B discourse has returned yet again. Well, the argument is, well, these people provide labor, our homegrown population cannot. And in your case, you often hear the NHS doctors. In ours, it's tech workers and rocket engineers and manufacturing types. And it would still be a problem if you had every single one of those millions of migrants was a high-skilled worker. That would be a problem. It'd create undue competition. But when they're not, when you were importing, as you've said, jihadists, sex criminals, and murderers, by and large, you start to look around and you're like, well, why are we doing this? This clearly isn't solving our population pyramid. This clearly isn't balancing the books on these sort of government Ponzi scheme welfare programs. Your pension systems are Social Security. And so at a certain point, you look around and you're like, why are we doing this? Like, who is benefiting? And one of the theories I've heard as regards the Conservative Party, and you can tell me if I'm wrong here. You mentioned earlier that the average price is near as makes no difference, 150 pounds a day, several billion a year. Is that, for instance, your Conservative Party is largely in the pocket of hotel chains and property developers. That is a large, effectively, interest group that wants their products subsidized. One, is that a fair reading of the situation if I picked up on that correctly? And two, given the fact that this doesn't seem to be solving an economic problem, it seems to be creating one, where do you see the motivation for this level of replacement level migration? Why do people allow it to happen?
Yeah, so I believe it's about a third of the Conservative Party's donors are property developers and large contract firms like Serco, which the memetics of the fact that it's run by Winston Churchill's grandson, the irony isn't lost on me. The fact that they are getting the contracts reliably means that it's interesting that our politicians, unlike yours, don't have to report their stock earnings. So one can only suspect, But there's also just this ideological commitment to the application of the blank slate to borders and this spreadsheet's eye view of, well, here's a universal standard human being, and they are fungible economic units that can be slotted into our national GDP generating machine like so many cogs. So we'll just take them from Somalia and drop them into Manchester, and they'll be as British as you and me with the prerequisite training and on the magic soil. And this narrative persists among the Conservative Party just as much it does among the Labour Party. The Conservative Party has an ethnic dimension because there are so many Indian MPs that lobbied for more Indian migration. Priti Patel called her fellow Indians living bridges, which is the phrase that Prime Minister Modi uses to describe how Indian diasporas can be leveraged as demographic then democratic pressure in foreign countries to India's advantage, keeping the borders open to the likes of H-1B visas. 71% of their recipients every year are Indians, thanks to the exploitative visa mills that are run over there and the ethno-nepotistic hiring practices of Silicon Valley, but also the fact that India is heavily reliant on remittances. It's like 3% of its economy. And, people would think, 3%, that's nothing. Bear in mind, at this point, if we squeeze out 0.3% annual growth in GDP, that's counted as a win for us. And India is hitting new records every year for the amount of money that is siphoned off in the trillions in remittances back to their home.
Which is literally direct wealth transfer. It is money coming out of your country to theirs. This is not the sort of relationship that where we're getting something for it, we're trading for raw resources. This is exploitation, pure and simple. Look, this is something I get a little bit fired up about because in much the same way you talk about the India lobby in your Conservative Party, we have seen the same thing happen in the Republican Party very recently. And perhaps my least favorite person in the world, Dinesh D'Souza, going well before the current the current controversy. He canceled quite a lot of people I like much more than him. But point is, you have this man who is a blood and soil nationalist for his own people, right? He calls people like you and I, whitey was, I think, the term he used, and basically gets to get fat off of effectively guilty white boomers who feel like they get to, have one of ours, our magical POC, using language kind of talk about it. But point is, you see these interest groups very clearly, as you've said, relating to kind of like Modi's plan for Hindu nationalism, very clearly acting with ethnic loyalty. And for many of those people, Dinesh D'Souza in particular, to turn around and say any sort of identity politics is illegitimate, and then the quiet part, well, except for mine. It's infuriating, genuinely infuriating. Sorry, brief aside, I can't really talk about Indians or Dinesh D'Souza without getting a little bit animated, but I'll throw it back to you, Connor.
I don't blame you, man. Tyler Oliveira did the world a public service by outing the ethno-narcissism of India.
I will say, I don't know anything about him really at all.
He follows me on Twitter now after I made a video about his poop throwing festival, so I think he's a patriot.
Fair enough. But that moment where he sort of fakes out that he's been scared off, the internet explodes with just absolute subcontinental ethnic chauvinism, and then he turns around and says, "Gotcha! It's coming out now." It's just an all-time great moment.
Yeah, fantastic. man, he looked like he did 10 tours in Nam after that finished anyway. But no, he, as you said, everyone's a blood and soil nationalist for somewhere, and it turns out Dinesh's is in a rural village in India that throws cow excrement at each other. And I'll actually tie this back, because part of the double standard that people do not like and that cannot last is every single ethnic and religious interest group and sexual preference subculture being able to play identity politics in our country in the ethnic and culturally heterogeneous environment that has been created since 1997. And Tony Blair's government said, according to Andrew Nether, the speechwriter for Home Office Minister Barbara Roach, that they wanted to rub the right's nose in diversity and render its argument out of date. Everyone gets to play identity politics, subsidized by the state, protected by unilateral hate speech laws, except the indigenous population. Or in your country, except Christian heritage Americans, who are actually the backbone of the country, who built it, who sustain its culture, who pass off the civilization down the chain of generations, and who pay the overwhelming amount of taxes that subsidize the stay of hostile tribal minorities. I'm seeing a pattern here that we're not allowed to notice. And so, tying back to the part of the question that I should have addressed but neglected to before, this is what Operation Raise the Colours is about. This is what these protests outside the asylum hotels are about. It is a demonstration of strength, of basically ethnic consciousness by the English, saying, no, this is our country, by the way. Like, this is our flag. The fact that our flag has become a symbol of protest inside our own country should show you how bad it is. And we're not going to wave the British flag, really, because that's a colonial symbol. That is a legal fictional identity that allows all the children of the empire to be folded back upon us and govern us. I mean, if you want a bleak picture, go to my Twitter feed and see yesterday's debate in Parliament between Iqbal Muhammad, Asparna Begum, and our Pakistani Muslim Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood, between a Bangladeshi, an Indian, and a Pakistani, arguing in Parliament about how to import more of their co-ethnics to that single British person involved in the conversation. So yeah, we're not going to wave the British flag. We're going to wave the exclusionary English flag to say this is our territory and we aren't leaving. And it's important to do that because, as you mentioned, in terms of demographics, so we have net migration until very recently. It's been revised down as of today. We had net migration running at almost 1 million a year. Total migration was 1 million a year. That's the same for a country the size of New York State that all of America has legally. So you think you have problems with H-1B Indians. We have 250,000 Indians coming every year, thanks to said Indian lobbying efforts in the Conservative Party. Former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak in 2014, before he was an MP, wrote a paper telling the Conservative government to import more Indians because they tend to vote Conservative. I'm sure Rishi Sunak wanted Indians just for demographic gerrymandering purposes. Wink, wink, nod.
Well, look, I mean, you have the execrable Rod Dreher informing us that Indians, this is from an article, I mean, not even a week old, informing us that they are, quote, natural conservatives, a phrase that has been around longer than either you or I have been alive, right? That we just need to allow this. And if we tailor our messaging as the American or British right, we can turn this to our advantage, which, if you remember, actually neither of us would, is literally exactly what George Bush said in the year 2000 when he issued a mass amnesty. And you may be familiar with this. The Hispanic vote did not turn out for George W. Bush or really any Republican ever. And so this argument is so clearly brought out in bad faith. We have run this experiment for, I don't know, my entire life. And it hasn't worked, to put it mildly. But sorry, I've interrupted you yet again, Tom. No,
you didn't. One, it's your show. Two, I'm glad you did, because I've spoken to Rod. I know him. He's always been very polite and complimentary to my work. I had not read that. That is insane. They're very conservative about being Indian. They're very conservative about Hinduism. They will not reproduce your civilization. The majority of them aren't Christians. Hey, look, I've met some very nice Indian Christians. I've met some Anglo-Indians who are half ethnically English. Do you know what I hope? I hope they take over their country and stop it being a shithole and run it according to Christian principles and develop it into somewhere where we might have a beneficial cultural exchange at some point, but we can leave it alone for a few hundred years and hope it works out for them. No thank you, no more Indians. So, but a point I was making about the UK is that we have been demographically swamped. We've been culturally disfigured. We have now this new emerging aesthetics that Kunli Drukpa coined called the UK, YOOKAY. And basically, if you imagine, it's like the set of Star Wars, like the incoherence of neon Pakistani-run vape shops, 1 billion barbershops on the high street that are pretty much all drug fronts, and endless kebab shops and halal butchers, where because of COVID and lockdowns, banks and quaint English high street staples have closed down. And so you walk outside and the world on your doorstep is just this garish third world bazaar. So like London has turned into Lahore and Birmingham has turned into Islamabad. All of these things have been wreaked upon us. And so what the English are doing is responding in two ways. One, they're leaving. So as of today, net migration projections were revised from 17,000 Brits leaving the country to 257,000. That is how much they'd undercounted. So even though people are saying, well, net migration's fallen, yeah, it's because the Brits are leaving and replacement is increasing. That plus the projections that say, and these are projections that have been floating around, that in 2024, half of all births and pregnancies in Britain resulted in an abortion. And that is disproportionately higher among the liberal, much younger indigenous population than it is among India, Africa, and Muslim communities who don't practice contraception, have 10 people to a household, and aren't going to abort their kids, and are therefore making up now 1/3 of all births to an immigrant mother. So either the demographics are being utterly replaced and the English are disappearing from their ancestral lands, or in the small ramparts where the English still exist, they're having this class war with luxury belief liberals who live in the shires who support refugees being welcome just over there. Like in Somerset, there was this crazy case recently where the deputy leader of the Green Party, who kept saying refugees are welcome, genuinely said they're all doctors and rocket scientists on camera. Like, she's insane. She wrote a letter to the government saying, well, you can't put 600 male asylum seekers in a military barracks over here because it's a threat to the local community. It's like, oh, really? What crimes are they going to commit if they're just doctors, lawyers, and engineers? Will they be running around randomly fixing pipes as plumbers, will they? What a catastrophe. So what you've got is this class war between the English, which our mutual friend Carl Benjamin has called Gammonzilla, the sort of waking consciousness of the English working class, putting up flags and going on Tommy Robinson's Unite the Kingdom rally and engaging in a kind of slopulism, but it's meant well. And it's because the traditional political establishment have just shut them out. So this is the only way they have to express their discontent is mass movements, which then, of course, eventually, hopefully, manufacture consent for established political parties to actually act on it rather than contain it. Or they just retreat. And so the reason they're displaying this consciousness is because the saboteurs within their midst, the complacent liberals who are accelerating the mass migration demographic revolution by saying that simultaneously we have no one to wipe old people's bottoms or serve coffee in Pret, but also they're all doctors, lawyers, and engineers. They're encouraging it to pay pensions, to make up the shortfall in birth rates, to fill these ever-expanding job vacancies. And so they're actively denigrating and taking down the flags of their countrymen who are saying, please stop inflicting crimes and costs on us and our children. And the government just aren't listening.
Well, and I think that dynamic you're talking about of the kind of burgeoning self-identity, right, is sort of an interesting thing because, and I mentioned this earlier with, D'Souza's book, After Racism, where that double standard has existed for a very long time. But it was sort of easier to hide when you were, as a population group, in the dramatic majority. Because then it's like, okay, well, identity politics is things for, people at the margins, the kind of minor groups that don't really affect things. So we don't need to act like that, whatever. But when it becomes an ever greater part of your population and parts of society that seem to be actively hostile, right? Not simply uncaring, but desirous of enriching themselves at your expense. You start to look around and you say, like, well, why am I not allowed to? It seems that I feel like we have some sort of collective interest. And this is something that I stole from my friend Dave, the distributist. He wrote a very good essay about this, basically asking, like, what would you have me do? And his point was basically like, all right, like from a good faith perspective, what are you telling me you were offering me? Like, what am I supposed to do according to the regime? And he was particularly talking to, kind of the regime conservatives in America, but I think it applies to your state as well, which is, what is the government of the YOOK? What are they offering the white British? What do they tell you? And okay, there's some platitudes we can throw around, but basically it seems to be your quality of services is decreasing. your quality of life generally is decreasing. We are replacing you. And if you have something to say about that, you're going to go to jail. There's not even really much of a pretense of a carrot anymore. It is simply a stick. And one thing that I've heard, I don't know how much, this is true, because anything you read on Twitter is just likely fake. But talking about the flight of wealth from the UK. I believe in the 2000s, your country ranked in the top 5 for millionaires, where wealthy people are going. That has decreased dramatically. Part of that flight you were talking about earlier. But this article was making the claim that the government is at least tossing around the idea of effectively an excise tax, right? If you leave, you're going to have to pay us to leave, which is sort of an interesting dynamic, right? It's sort of something that's almost Soviet sounding, right? If you can get out, you'll have to pay for your visa, again, to kind of support the welfare state. So if my reading is accurate, what is sort of the political formula here? What are the legacy political parties, which, as far as I understand, seem to be sort of passing away? What are they offering the average Brit? What are they offering the average voter who is not one of these designated client groups?
So as regards to the economy, we are the nation leading losing millionaires. We have beaten China. And also as a country, we are now poorer than every single American state, including Mississippi. It gets even worse if you remove London from the picture, because London is skewing the scales because it's the epicenter of financial services. Everywhere else is deprived. It's upwards of 70% of all jobs created since the 2008 financial crash have gone to migrant workers. So we have actively replaced our own population. We've just battery farmed low-wage foreigners. 95% of foreign people who come in every year are not net taxpayers, and only 15% come principally to work. And even if they were here working, they're still doing a revolving door of demographics and changing my culture before my eyes, so they're not welcome. So what are major political parties' responses to this? So let's go one by one. The current Labour government are trying unsuccessfully to play umpire between all of these tribal minorities because they are dedicated socialists and Blairites, and so they believe in the blank slate. They genuinely believe that every single one of us is equal deep down, that all cultural differences, economic disparities, differences in education, and the injustice of being pried apart geographically can be easily remedied by a Leviathan state. And this is being prescribed in the pages of the New Statesman. There's an awful essay that was just written that I need to go through on my channel by the author John Gray, who wrote The New Leviathans, who has just said, we need a Hobbesian state to make all of these groups play nice. And it's like, or I could just denaturalize and deport all the people that are making these problems, rather than erecting knife detection metal barriers outside Westminster Abbey, which has stood for 1,000 years with no trouble, but all of a sudden, diversity being our strength, requires these massive invasive surveillance measures to be inflicted on the host population and criminal minorities alike. Labour are the most unpopular government on record. Keir Starmer is apparently in, quote, bunker mode in the last week because he's feeling the heat from his health secretary, Wes Streeting, who I've nicknamed Brutus in waiting because he's obviously been ambitious and tried to take over. He used to work for Stonewall and has been running an uncapped puberty blockers trial on thousands of children funded with almost 11 million in taxpayer cash, basically off the books, even after the Supreme Court ruling that said, men are men, women are women, and the closure of the Tavistock Clinic. So he is a crazy trans ideologue who has also endorsed an Islamophobia definition that says conversations about the grooming gang scandal is Islamophobic. And then the other contender is Shabana Mahmood, the woman currently LARPing as an immigration restrictionist, but is opening new safe and legal routes to take the guys out of the dinghies and just put them on a charter flight straight into our living room. She said that her Sunni Muslim faith is the most important thing in her life and guides all of what she does as a public policymaker. So she's playing a very clever game with public optics at the moment and is most likely to take over as Britain's first Muslim Prime Minister. Yippee. So that's what the Labour Party are delivering us, and they're going to be whittled down to even double-digit seats if they're lucky at the next election. The Conservative Party are on the brink of selling off the furniture in their headquarters and members' clubs as firewood, and yet their old guard are still clinging to the liberal fictions of yesteryear. Like, you've got Charles Moore as the chairman of The Spectator saying it would be uncivilized to deport people to have handled the immigration problem back when Enoch Powell warned about it in 1968. I think it's a lot more uncivilized to lose your civilization to third world barbarians. But yet again, boomers cling to the dignity of establishments and procedures more than they do actually saving the country for their children and grandchildren.
Well, I take the radical position that stabbing people with knives is uncivilized. Call me a radical, but sorry.
No, it's curious how there was never a mass stabbing epidemic by Boy Scouts or even Sikhs or housewives before, we imported men from the Horn of Africa and Jamaica, where they.
Well, you have a country that has had access to knives for quite a while, to put it mildly. I mean, the Romans seem to have plenty of problems getting stabbed by you people a long time ago. So, clearly it was a technology that was available to them.
But that's apparently, if you haven't seen the book from last week, that's apparently because the Scottish Picts were black. Genuinely, this is what they're doing. They're vandalizing our history to deprive us of any argument, of any claim to indigeneity, and therefore any argument against mass replacement migration. And
we was Picts, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we Been Here from the Start was the song by Horrible Histories, where a black guy dressed in Roman armor was saying that Britain had always been black. Honestly, it's literally like Black Hebrew Israelite stuff that's being mainstreamed by our state broadcaster and the government. So, but on this point about the Conservative Party, so I had a debate with Michael Gove, who may be familiar to some of you. He's the editor of The Spectator, who his first move as Spectator editor, meant to be the oldest right-wing magazine in Britain and has an international reach. He endorsed Kamala Harris for the presidency, and he said, "I do what Dick Cheney tells me to do. So lose." Michael Gove was the longest serving cabinet minister of the last 14 years of government. He is an avatar of failure. He has been the mentor to Kemi Badenoch, and Kemi Badenoch, the African woman, the Yoruba Nigerian, as she self-declared in an interview with Gove last December, who has cratered the Conservative Party's chances, but as a DEI hire, has been amplified by every old guard Conservative, Fraser Nelson, Neil Ferguson, Charles Moore, Gove throughout her career, and shepherded to the front line into a job she's wholly unqualified for. But as for Gove, I had a debate with him about 2 months ago now, and they sought to censor that debate and ban the footage from being released for a number of reasons, mainly probably because I blamed him for the mass migration experiment that he championed and presided over and said, diversity is our strength at every opportunity. But during the debate, I brought up the fact that he gave a cover endorsement to Yoram Hazony's book, which was, what's it called? I've got it on the shelf. It's just called The Jewish State, right? And so Hazony wrote a book basically making an explicitly ethno-nationalist case for Israel in the early 2000s. And Hazony is openly an ethno-nationalist. Michael Gove gave a cover endorsement to the book in his review in the Times when he was a journalist, saying, let me actually read it. He said, "Quite simply the best guide to appear to the dominant ideological questions of our time." So I asked him, why does Israel get to be an ethno-state for Jews, whereas you demand Britain be diverse, multicultural, liberal, pluralist, and multi-ethnic, and you don't even admit that English ethnic people exist? Because he said Rishi Sunak, the Indian, is English. And he looked me in the eye, and he said to me, well, it's a strength of Israel that its democracy could allow for a non-Jewish person to be elected. And I said, do you think any of the Jews in Israel would elect a non-Jew to be prime minister or president of Israel? And two, if demographics got to such a point where a non-Jew was elected as the head of Israel, would it still be Israel? Or would the culture have changed and therefore the Jewish people no longer protected? He moved swiftly on during that debate because he didn't want to answer that question. And this is the point that we were making. Every group can play identity politics, including particularly in the Republican Party and the Conservative Party, Jewish interest groups, as we've seen with the struggle session in Heritage, the self-defeating struggle session. I mean, if you guys wanted to basically create anti-Semitism, you're going the right way about it. And I say this as someone who doesn't Jewsburg online, guys, if Israel has a PR department, it's shit.
For your own sake, take Mark Levin and put him in a box somewhere. Don't let him talk. Because everything he says is something that Joseph Goebbels would also say with slightly different emphasis. I'll leave it at that to whoever is listening.
It's what the late great Charlie Kirk said in his text. He just said, "Look, Jewish donors are living up to the stereotypes, trying to get me to deplatform my friends." And so, guys, don't do it. But if Jewish groups are allowed on both sides of the political aisle, on both sides of the Atlantic, to play identity politics and insist, in the case of liberal Jews, that we must be a nation of immigrants, which is something that, it's a phrase that Barbara Roach, herself Jewish, the former Home Secretary under Blair, used for Britain. So import it from America. So is she saying, like, because of the Viking invasions, the Norman conquests, that we have always been immigrants? Moronic. But how can this double standard sustain, where Jewish groups on both sides of the political aisle are allowed to play identity politics, where liberal Jews insist, and their co-belligerents in the Conservative Party insist, that Britain, America in the case of the Republicans, must be diverse, tolerant, accepting of Hinduism and Judaism and Islam, and you can't be too Christian, and that the heritage populations can't have an identity politics of their own, while Israel exists as the exception, the ethno-state. Because my standard is pretty consistent. My standard is, I want for England what Israel has. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to make all of my politics about Israel, either for or against. What it means is, I would like my country to be for my countrymen, to protect them without apology. And the people who are the most ardent defenders of Israel in the Conservative Party are unwilling to have that standard for England. So that is why the Conservative Party, I think, has been completely unable to adapt to the rising nativist conscience among the British public in response to the mass demographic experiment they ran with the Boris wave, importing 4 million third worlders in 4 years. So the Green Party have adapted. The Green Party have become explicitly the Islamic Foreigner Communist Party. So they're led by a man called Zach Polanski. That's not his real name. He changed his name to be more Jewish. He is a gay Jewish hypnotist. He literally claimed he could hypnotize women to grow their breasts, which is probably the only likable thing about him. He has insisted that anyone can become British. He constantly calls people fascists and Nazis, which, as we know, is just another word for I can kill you, per the post-war morality, per the death of Charlie Kirk and the attempts on President Trump's life. He has been going around the media rounds and actually growing the Green Party's base because he is explicitly leaning into the foreign grievance-mongering constituency and the unfortunately disproportionately progressive young women base in this country, to where now the Labour Party is in fourth behind the Greens. The Greens are at like 15%. So they're actually likely to form a coalition with the Liberal Democrats, which are the luxury belief party of Middle England, you know, very rich. You would think of it as the people who live in Martha's Vineyard, basically. The party for those guys, they will form an alliance with the Islamic Communist Party. The co-leader of the Greens, by the way, is a guy called Mothin Ali, a councillor who won his election last year and shouted, Allahu Akbar, this is for Gaza. Presumably Allahu Akbar meaning recycling in Arabic. So they were likely to form a coalition with the Middle England party that says, you know, refugees welcome, just not in my backyard. So the only other party that's left on the table now is Reform. And Reform are coasting at a comfortable 30-odd% in consistent polls. They're likely to be the next party of government. Problem with Reform is, as my recent blacklisting from one of their events has showed, that they are willing to salami slice off allies, spokespeople, policy advisors, supporters from the right, and consistently cave to the demands of the left. And even though they have eventually caught up on things like mass deportations, though their commitment to mass deportations is like 150,000 a year, which is woeful considering we have at least 2 million illegal migrants in the country. Their commitment to depriving the Boris wave of indefinite leave to remain, good, but, you know, still not enough. We need mass denaturalizations and deportations of the people that were never wanted here in the first place committing crimes. The fact that they've only just caught up to this, but still risk of us, still denouncing people, still appointing Muslim spokespeople like Zia Yusuf and Layla Cunningham, still have a party chairman called David Bull, who, himself a gay man, has said that trans men, should be in women's prisons. And he said, Britain is an island of immigrants. Immigration has been our lifeblood. It always has been. Reform are still far too progressive than the general voting public. It's just that the public don't pay that much attention to politics. And so they are voting for Reform as the anti-immigration party. They think they'll just live up to what they want them to be. And look, I hope they do. I am more interested in saving the country than my personal platform, which is why I exist outside the party paradigm as applying carrot and stick. It's why I haven't censored myself to take a safe seat or to take a job within Reform. And believe me, I've had a few people offer it. I would rather force them to be better if they're going to win the next election. And so that's the lay of the political land at the moment. Nigel Farage is probably going to be the next prime minister. If a coalition of resentful foreigners and insane liberals don't try to block him, form a kind of firewall like the German parties did to keep the AfD out, Nigel Farage is probably going to get stonking majority, And unless he puts all the things that he needs to do, like repealing laws and deportations and firing civil servants in his manifesto, it will get blocked by the House of Lords and they won't be able to get anything done. It'll be Trump term 1 rather than Trump term 2.
There's several things there. One, your comments on the selective ethno-narcissism of our leaders. It's incredibly frustrating to me because, look, like, I think that your remarks about not making Israel the center of all of your opinions, either pro or against, is quite apt. But at the same time, clearly, we have leaders in my country as well as yours who are rabid, blood nationalist, effectively ethno-nationalists, who believe in a people's right to a state that is the highest priority in their mind. And yet, when it turns to the country they are allegedly representing, they have a much more liberal view. They have other priorities. You have figures like Ben Shapiro, I've mentioned multiple times, who, as Tucker Carlson expertly pointed out, seems to care much more about any particular person's relationship to the state of Israel and his alleged conservative values. And you look at that and you're like, well, I would like that level of deference, that level of priority placed on me and my concerns for my own elected officials. That seems to be a relatively reasonable request, that I be considered the top priority. And look, we understand politics is corrupt. Humans are corrupt. We're not looking for a perfect philosopher king. But that doesn't seem to be an unreasonable request. It doesn't seem to be unreasonable to say, hey, can the top priority of an American politician be Americans, or a British politician be the English? I shouldn't have said that. I should have said British, right? That's a controversial subcategory. We'll table that for the moment. And I mean, to your point about the salami slicing, this is exactly what we've seen happen in American domestic politics over the last 2 weeks. You have seen a desire to, as Sam Francis, who himself was canceled, wrote about in Beautiful Losers, right, to sort of sacrifice your allies to appease your enemies. And what we've seen over and over and over again is that is a strategy for losers. That is not a strategy that gives you ultimate electoral success. It is a strategy that dooms you to being the loyal opposition rump party, eternal losers. As I believe Michael Anton said, right, the Washington Generals of politics, doomed to exist purely to allow your opposition to look great when they beat you. And look, man, the stakes have gotten much higher. We've seen with Kirk. If you are, and Kirk was relatively moderate in the grand scheme of things, if you are one of those fascists, if you are one of those Nazis, you are no longer simply allowed to coast through your political career, cash in, live a comfortable life. You might get shot. You might get killed. And so the consequences of losing are now much, much higher than they used to be. And the idea that faced with the demographic catastrophe befalling both of our countries, faced with the economic problems facing both of our countries, where young people are effectively locked out of the traditional paths to sort of, have something at stake, to integrate themselves with society. And the idea that we can simply go back to the kind of comfortable, traditional conservative relationship where we get a little upset about nasty things said, we get a little bit upset about how fast things are changing, but it would be rude, it would be uncivilized to actually form some sort of resistance to that. That's not working anymore. You see this in my own state of Virginia, right, with the loss of Winsome Earl Sears. The idea that, again, if we run our own POC, that will be the magic bullet. We'll get the magic consent of minority groups we need to be considered legitimate. Look, man, we've been running this experiment for decades at this point. Both the attitudes of different conservative movements, but also in and of itself, the idea of mass migration. And I feel like we don't need to keep running this experiment. After the 10th time, after the however many elections it's been, can we maybe just accept that maybe our priors, the sort of blank slate ideology you were talking about, is not entirely representative of reality, to put it mildly? But Connor, unfortunately, I'm going to have to step out. I will be appearing actually to debate a topic very similar to this in just a few minutes. So we're going to need to wrap up the recording. But if people want to find more of you and your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
They can follow me on X at @Con_Tomlinson. They can find me on YouTube at Connor Tomlinson. They can find me on Substack at Connor Tomlinson or Tomlinson Talks. And I do plenty of writing for Courage Media. Thank you very much for the reunion, sir.
course, man. Good to finally meet you face to face. And I will say, I don't watch a lot of media. I don't listen to a lot of it because if you produce a lot, it can sort of become an Ouroboros. But your YouTube videos are quite good and are very helpful for someone who wants to understand what is happening in your country. And I cannot bring myself to read legacy British media. It is horrible. So you provide a valuable service. Highly recommend it. As far as my stuff, The Jay Burden Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you want to listen to podcasts. This is what I do. It's my full-time job. And if you want to support me, you can throw me a few bucks on Patreon, Substack, or Gumroad. You'll get the episodes early and ad-free. You can also check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. Connor, I appreciate it. And everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever.